might get started today. I suspect we'll have a couple of stragglers. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on this, what promises to be a really, really interesting panel about foreign states and civil war. We're extremely lucky that Mohsen, I should have checked the pronunciation of your name, Solhdoost? Solhdoost? Okay, good work. Has joined us. He's flown all the way from Brisbane this morning, which is no small feat. He's been up since the crack of dawn. And Mohsen, on top of having flown all that way today, is also what I call an end-stage PhD candidate. So Mohsen is very much at the business end of his PhD. His drafts are currently under consideration by his supervisors, and so I think it is an absolute superhuman effort actually to be here, so thank you for that. Mohsen's PhD is being undertaken at the University of Queensland. He did his undergraduate studies in Iran. He completed postgraduate programs at the international relations at the University in Japan and at Fordham University in the United States. He also studied a Master of Arts in British Literature and did a Master of International Studies as a Rotary Peace Fellow in UQ. You are more qualified than most of us here. Please join me in welcoming Mohsen. A little bit of housekeeping, Mohsen, 25 minutes maybe, and then we'll follow with questions, if that suits everyone. Shahram sends his sincere apologies today. Shahram organised this event, was incredibly excited about it, was incredibly excited to see Mohsen again. Shahram came, he's on annual leave at the moment, he came to campus for the event and looked so sick that I sent him home. So poor old Shahram has got, I don't know if it's man flu or actual flu, but he sends his apologies.
Thank you.
The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Dara. A very good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back here at Deakin and catch up with faces I've seen before at the conference. So the research I'm presenting today is about foreign states and civil war. First, I'll give you a little bit of the background to the research, where I started with the research. So back in 2011, 2012, we saw that some popular uprisings in Syria and Libya spiraled out of control pretty quickly. So we had the civil war started in Syria, and then around the same time we had the regime change or the humanitarian intervention in Libya happening. What was very perplexing or confusing for me was that where all of a sudden all these states were involved in the civil war, particularly in Syria. And I remembered back in 2009, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, actually admitted that, well, when she was talking about Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization of Al-Qaeda, she was saying that, well, the people we are fighting today are the same people we funded 20 years ago. So she was talking about Afghan Mujahideen that were armed and funded by U.S., Saudi Arabia through Pakistan back in 1980s to push the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. But the interesting thing was that Hillary Clinton was actually the same person who championed the same strategy once again in Syria on a very larger scale. So she started this program of arming against Syrian rebels, doing the same thing in Libya. And that was very confusing for me. So if policymakers are already aware of some unintended consequences, some negative unintended consequences, why do they do this again? To find some relevant literature, I did a very in-depth, let's say, review of the literature. I identified three broad themes in the literature. First one was civil wars. So there's a lot of literature about how non-state armed groups reach out to states to find resources and how this contributes to the onset of civil wars. There's also literature about how states' connection to non-state armed groups actually contributes to the, or has an impact on the outcome of civil wars. For example, how it prolongs civil wars, how it might contribute to an increasing number of civilian casualties, how it might contribute to, let's say, use of violence by non-state armed groups after they receive support, or how it contributes to their success or failure. So the first two subgroups of this theme actually addressed where and when this happens. And the third part, the third subgroup actually talked about who these non-listed armed groups are. What is the ideological or the identity component of these non-listed armed groups that perhaps is the cause that establishes the relation between states and non-listed armed groups. But this was all about civil wars. We've got some non-listed armed groups that are not involved in civil wars, yet they are still they have got connections with states. So I identified another, let's say, theme in the literature. It was the transnational relations, how states reach out to non-listed armed groups for different purposes. In this theme, we have got some rational explanations about how states are likely to reach out to non-listed armed groups for rational reasons. For example, they might find non-listed armed groups, the rebel groups, as potential allies, as agents, or as proxies to do their bidding, to do the dirty work for them. And as rational explanations might argue, well, it gives them the benefit of lowering the cost, not only the financial cost, but also by, let's say, lowering the risk of losing their own soldiers in the battlefield. It gives them the benefit of plausible deniability. If they want to do something and then deny it later, they could do that through their proxies. So states use them as either proxies or insurgencies and terrorist organizations. That was another broad theme of the literature. Yet, in the first two themes, there was nothing about the consequences of what happens to the states when they provide support to these non-listed armed groups. So there was another strand of literature that directly actually addressed the issue of blowback. The term blowback was initially used by the CIA back in 1953 when they orchestrated the coup again to remove the Iranian prime minister. There were some classified documents prepared in the CIA talking about the unintended consequences. Later in 2001, once the September 11th attacks happened, we saw that scholars and authors also used the term blowback, discussing the policy of supporting these rebel groups back in 1980s and how it backfired back in 2001. So what I did was, well, I thought there has to be some sort of connection between these themes of literature. And given the background about Syria, I formulated or I framed the research question this way. Given the likelihood of blowbacks, why do states keep providing support to non-listed armed groups? And as I mentioned in the existing literature, if there are, for example, rational explanations are not likely to explain seemingly irrational behavior. If this is happening for decades, it is not a rational foreign policy. There should be something else explaining or justifying this sort of behavior. And the first part of my question, the likelihood of blowbacks. I had this, let's say, hypothetical argument here. Well, how likely is it? I needed to establish this based on facts and figures. How likely is that providing support to these rebel groups or non-listed armed groups might backfire? So I started looking for data sets to see how often it happens. The best one that I found was the non-state actor dataset, version 3.4, prepared by Gleditsch, Cunningham, and Salehian. It includes data about all cases of non-state armed groups connected to their sponsors from World War II to 2013. So they have created this list of all dyads, the dyadic relation between a rebel group and a sponsor. The sponsors could be states or other rebel groups. And they have, I think, listed about 600 cases of both cases of allegation and also explicit support. Yet, I didn't want to get engaged in cases of allegation because it's too difficult to find hard evidence about it. If it's only allegations, it's difficult to prove anything if there's no hard evidence about that. What I did was I took part of their data set and a chunk of that out, and then I developed that sort of horizontally. What I did was I chose a time frame started in 1980 and extended the data set to 2017. And the reason that I did this was, as far as I was going to look at explicit cases of support, this was the foreign policy which was very openly actually exercised by the United States during the Cold War and the final years of the Cold War, and then it continued. So, and also the date actually coincided with three other important events. First, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So I identified 92 cases of explicit external support. And when I say cases, here each case does not mean that it's an individual organization. Some of these cases are clusters. They are like umbrella organizations. Like Free Syrian Army I have identified 46 subgroups for one umbrella organization. The other thing I did, I tried to have some inclusive definitions for the data set. So I adopted this definition for non-state armed groups that could include all non-state entities, not only terrorist organizations, not only the rebel groups that are involved in civil wars, any non-state entity that received support from states. I created categories for targeted states. This did not exist in other data sets that I looked for. So I created categories for targeted states, which states were targeted by these non-state armed groups, and which sponsoring states actually provided support to these non-state armed groups. The other important thing that I added to this or developed the data set was creating the categories for external support. This hasn't been done in other data sets either. So I created these categories: military, financial, sanctuary, diplomatic, training, and logistical, so that I could later on do some statistical or quantitative work with this to see which type of external support is more popular, for example. Geopolitical regions, that was another important thing to know. And so I adopted, for example, for the Middle East, I adopted the Greater Middle East region. And the reason I adopted this definition was that back in 1980s, U.S. Department of State was pretty much having the same definition for a region that starts from north of Africa, includes Middle East, plus Afghanistan. And they have the same foreign policy for the whole region. Africa, Europe, America, Asia, and Oceania. And the most important part was blowback. This is again something that doesn't exist in other data sets. I created different categories for the blowback. What do I mean by blowback? If non-state armed groups are following the goals intended by the states, fine. If there are indirect effects, that's what I defined. If there is an actor outside this dyadic relation and does something which was not intended by the sponsoring state, I defined that as indirect effect. The third category, blowback, if the non-state actor that is receiving support does something which was not intended by the sponsoring state, I define that as blowback. And backfire blowback, the worst case scenario. If the sponsored non-state armed groups actually turns against the sponsoring state and engages in armed conflict against the sponsoring state. So I identified 53 states that were involved in this states' relations with non-state armed groups, and 92 cases, as I mentioned, and these are the top sponsoring states. I'm not sure if you can read them. First one, United States, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Israel, and Iran. The top one is the United States, and with 27 cases of support. And once again, each case doesn't mean that it's a singular organization. It could be a cluster. Different percentages of support. So military support was more popular than all other types of support. Then we had sanctuary, then financial, diplomatic, training, and logistical. Geographical percentage, more than half of these cases happen in the Greater Middle East region. And again, the important part was the blowback. Perhaps, if we have time, we can have a look at the data set, and I'll show that In 92% of the cases, I have identified some form of blowback, either indirect effects or blowback or backfire blowback. So that was a very high rate of blowback. Now, it actually contributed to the first part of the research question, that saying, given the likelihood of blowbacks, it is a very high rate. If in 92% of the cases you see it backfires, why do they do that? For the top sponsoring states, U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel, U.S. in 22 cases out of 27 cases, they had some backfires. So it's 81%. For Saudi Arabia, 100% of cases backfired. For Israel, 92% of the cases. And the reason I chose these three was that these three top sponsoring states are the only ones that had this backfire blowback, the worst kind of blowback. And they are the ones that are actually the top sponsoring states. They have experienced the worst thing, yet they are the top sponsoring states. This is the beautiful slide about these top sponsoring states. I did this visual representation of these three states providing support to these non-state armed groups. It's from 1980 to 2017. So it's like dozens of cases. I don't think you can read that from there, but there's this interesting application, Gephi. You can visualize the networks for it. It's very good for network analysis. So you can imagine how the whole data set is. This is only 3 states, and I've identified 53 states. So if I wanted to add the other states here, it would be like a mess. We couldn't read anything. Now I had 3 top sponsoring states, so I had my case studies. I was going to do a cross comparison across these 3 cases. The methodology for answering why questions, perhaps it's about decision, and as far as it's about decision making, the best approach to answer why questions was to use foreign policy analysis tools. There are different approaches in foreign policy analysis. For example, the first approach argues that human agents actually create meaning in foreign policy decision making. Or the second approach talks about framing entrepreneurs, those who actually compete about different decision makings or different themes in foreign policy. For example, the lobby groups, you can see in US foreign policy, the Jewish lobby is a very strong lobby, so how they actually influence the US foreign policy making. The third approach talks about how foreign policy decision makers actually make their decisions based on their interactions with their counterparts. When they meet each other, they might actually make some decisions. The fourth approach talks about emotion and effect, how emotion and effect actually colors rational choice for foreign policy decision makers. So the first 4 approaches, they are very useful to examine dynamic decision makings. But what I'm looking at is not dynamic. There is a static, continued pattern of foreign policy. The data set shows that, well, from 1980 to 2017, this pattern of foreign policy has continued, regardless of who is there, regardless of party politics, whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, they do the same thing. So it was a very static pattern of foreign policy, and the most useful approach was the national role conception, which argues that policymakers actually perceive of the role of their nation in the international system. There are some models of national role conception arguing that, well, policymakers might actually have self-conceptualization of the role of their states in the international system. There are some action-focused models arguing that policymakers make decisions or perceive of the role of their states in response to the expectations by other states in the international system. But what was here perhaps most useful for me was that what is the underlying reason which hasn't changed over time, which has actually justified this static pattern of foreign policy. So I needed to look at some internal variables rather than external variables. And the level of analysis it was not reliant on individual decision makers. As I said, this pattern of foreign policy has continued over time, for 4 decades at least. So it was not done by individual decision makers, or it was not pushed by groups. It is something at a state level. So adopting this national role conception as an approach, I did some qualitative content analysis of these 3 cases. I looked at the foreign policy statements of the leaders who talk about their national role in the international system when they are talking about providing external support to these non-state armed groups. So what I wanted to find was, what is that ideological or identity principle when they are referring to that in their speech, in their statements, in their official correspondence. So I created these categories. I followed Sherry's qualitative content analysis, which provides a very systematic approach, step by step, to apply the qualitative content analysis to foreign policy statements. The first category was about the sources. I wanted to know what internal source is actually contributing to this foreign policy decision making. The first category was that, well, if it's about ideology or if it's coming from the role conception, what is the reason? Is it just because it's a devious stratagem? Is it the least bad option, simply? Or is it, are there any tactical considerations? Or is there alliance commitments? And all these categories are actually mutually exclusive, so that helped a lot with the qualitative content analysis of the foreign policy statements. The first case I did was United States, and the ideological component of foreign policy decision making I identified was American exceptionalism. 5 minutes, sure. Going very quickly. So for this case, it was American exceptionalism, started with the city on hill. Each and every U.S. president talks about how exceptional the United States is. They talk about American model. When they want to bring democracy to Afghanistan, they want to do the same thing in Syria. Let's bring democracy to Libya, and we see how it happens. And perhaps it was first articulated by Ronald Reagan in 1989, when he was the one actually used the term again, and the other president, his successors, used the term too. So I did that in chronological order. Each administration from 1980 to 2017, I found out at least 5 foreign policy statements in each administration where I could actually do the content analysis. Second case was Israel. The Holocaust was the very important ideological component of Israeli identity. What informs Israeli foreign policy decision making is that we just never again, we don't have to let it happen to us again. If it's Iran, for example, having a nuclear program, if that's posing some existential threat to Israel, we have to stop them at any costs. And as I mentioned, the least bad option was providing support to these non-state armed groups, providing support to Jundullah, to Mujahideen Khalq, to Pajak, or all other like terrorist organizations that could perhaps do some assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. It was the least bad option because other options was direct military confrontation with Iran, which would be more costly. So same with Israel, I did with different cabinets starting from 1980 to 2017. Saudi Arabia, the ideological component of foreign policy decision making, or the pillar of Saudi statehood, is Wahhabism. The revivalist ideology from mid-17th century that is actually like half of Saudi statehood, and the other half is the political power of Al Saud family. There are some statements talking about Wahhabism, how it actually informs foreign policy decision making, and how much the Wahhabi ulama have got power in pushing their agenda in Saudi foreign policy. And The same with this case, I did it in chronological order, starting with King Khaled, then King Fahd, King Abdullah, and then King Salman, the present King of Saudi Arabia. So, finally, the findings. Different imperatives such as strategic concerns influence foreign policy behavior, yet it is the national world conception that supersedes other motivations and frames the choice of foreign policy decision-making in such a way that external support to non-state armed groups turns out to be the least bad option. So that was the finding of the research and the conclusion. And thank you for listening. Hope it was not too complicated.
You're very punctual. Thank you. We had a minute to spare.
Oh, thank you.
Probably should have done. Thank you very much for sharing your findings. This seems like such an exciting PhD project. As you know, we're doing a lot of research on this very topic at Deakin at the moment, so it's really, really interesting to hear your findings. I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. Do we have any? Yes, Khaled? Maybe introduce yourself first, actually.
Hi, this is Robert.
Yeah, you just press the button when you turn on, and when you're finished talking, turn it off.
Okay, my name is Khalid. I'm doing PhD here at Deakin, ADI. I have a question about the causal mechanism. So basically, you mentioned how these role conceptions lead these states to support these non-state armed groups. Could you please clarify, the causal mechanism through which this national role conception exactly influences the decision to support this group and the role conception and not something else, because that's the other important consideration in terms of causal relationship, right? Thank you.
Sure. The national role conception, when foreign policy decision makers, they perceive of the role of their states in the international system. That means they assume some responsibilities for the role that they are assuming. So if United States is assuming the leadership of the war or the role of a hegemon, there are some responsibilities for the hegemon. If Saudi Arabia is actually defining or describing its national role as the leader of the Muslim world, so there are some responsibilities for the leader of the Muslim world. The justification they had, for example, back in 1980s, they were like Saudi leaders were saying, well, these godless communists have invaded the land of Islam, the Muslim land. So we've got this, they call it Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam. So what is the responsibility of the leader of the Muslim world? We have to push them back. But they couldn't engage in military confrontation with Soviet Union. That would cost them a lot, or that could be suicidal, in fact. The thing was that they provided support to these Afghan mujahideen. In a lot of cases for Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, if you look at the title of the king of Saudi Arabia, the custodian of two holy mosques, like all Muslims are turning towards Saudi Arabia for their daily prayers. So the role that they are assuming in the international system is that we have to lead the Muslim world. We have to do something. And the least bad option is to do it through these proxies, these allies, or you can call them terrorist organizations or other groups.
Sorry, my question is that, why not some rational strategic decision driving this policy about national role conception? Like in Syria, look at, for example, the United States supporting the Kurdish groups. There's a clear strategic basis for this. This is just one example. I know you have done research on many more. But there's a clear strategic reason behind that, right? Why the United States now feels obligated to support the Kurds there. So, why not that about role conception?
Yeah. Yeah, if you remember about the blowbacks I mentioned, rational explanations cannot explain. If you are aware of blowbacks, if you know that in 92% of the cases, there have been some backfiring blowbacks. So why do you do this? It is not rational. This is a seemingly irrational behavior. If you know there is a 92% risk of doing something, if you do something, for example, there will be some blowback issues, would you still do that? It is not very rational.
Not doing anything is going to cause much worse than that. Well, because you have to like compare what is blowback and what's the result of the inaction. If the inaction is going to cause something much worse than the blowback.
Yep. Well, the inaction is, again, we have to look at the national role of these three, particularly these three top sponsoring states. Their national role is includes or incorporates some responsibilities for them. Inaction is not part of that. They have to do something. If there is a part of Dar al-Islam or land of Islam invaded by some godless people, they have to do something. The inaction is not part of that. That is very condescending to them, to their role. If U.S. is talking about like beacon of freedom, the American model, we have to do something. We have to bring democracy to Venezuela. We have to do the same thing in Libya. We have to do the same thing in Syria. We have to do the same thing with Iran. There is this ideology. The ideological component is not very rational. Yes, there are blowback issues, but still they do it.
I want to jump in there because I think that's really interesting. So firstly, I just wanted to say I really applaud all the work that you've done. It's a very rigorous, methodical project, and obviously it's taken a lot of time and energy to compile all of that data. But I want to pick up on this idea of rational and irrational, which I think is sort of driving the thrust of where you're going with this. But it seems to me that that's normative, that you're making a call about what's rational and irrational. So what happens if your goal is destabilisation? Then you're prepared, or what happens if your goal is ideological or religious? And you're prepared to wear, in fact you determine to wear some degree of blowback towards the greater cause. So if your cause is a bigger religious goal, or a bigger political or ideological goal, or your cause is in fact to completely destabilise Syria, which is the case of Saudi Arabia, it's also the case of Israel, and certainly they play a destabilising role. Iran was one of the cases that's all about destabilisation. So they calculate that some degree of blowback will come through supporting these non-governmental actors. They know that they're not stupid. They knew when Iran entered Iraq and Syria, they knew that they would likely suffer terrorist attacks on Iranian soil, which they have suffered. They in fact made statements saying that that was a likely outcome of Iranian involvement in those two conflicts. So they calculate that some degree of blowback. But if your broader cause is ideological, political, religious, then is it, that kind of speed, that's a rational calculation then, not an irrational calculation. You're sort of making this normative judgment, and it's difficult, I think, to see where you draw that line between what's rational and irrational. So I also want to just point a couple of other quick things. In the US, in the case of the US, and certainly I would say in the case of many sort of modern democratic states, there's also another rational calculation, which is if that blowback comes after my term in government, right? So this is a democratic calculation.
Yep.
Then it's better in my strategic short-term interests to rather than go to war to fight the Soviet Union, we will just fund some small proxy actors because it's cheaper, it's easier, costs us less lives. And the blowback will come 20 years later. Let Hillary Clinton deal with that blowback. I don't have to worry about it. It's way into the future. So when you have a political system built on 4-year terms, I think it's, it becomes very difficult to put this kind of rational, irrational argument because people are obviously going to be motivated by short-term agendas, which is different to the agendas I was speaking about before, the kind of broader ideological, political, religious agendas that drive states like Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I think also, just finally, when you're doing your analysis of the foreign policy statements of all these, and you said very rightly, chronologically, and so on, I think you really have to be careful, perhaps even a bit more cynical, in the sense that what states say they're motivated by is very different to how states act and what they're actually motivated by. So Israel's motivations, it's a really populist thing to say the Holocaust happened and will never again and so on. It appeals, it has a kind of visceral momentum, right? But that doesn't mean that's actually what they're motivated by or why they're engaging in these wars to stop another Holocaust. It's not even there's no realistic parallel between the two, between the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and between, whatever threat they face in the region today. Same with Saudi Arabia, same with the US. The light on the hill is just it's just a thing to get people's attention, right? It's a populist message. Nothing to do with their actual strategic interests in the region and why they would engage different actors. So all of that sounds like a lot of criticism, which it's not meant to come across as, because I think what you're doing is really brilliant, and I think there's a lot of really good data in there. But it just needs some careful thought as you kind of move through these very complex terrain. Yeah.
Your project has certainly brought up some of the great unanswered debates in international relations. It once after working on it for probably a decade. I'm not sure that you've.
I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that. But.
Yeah, that was very interesting. The case of Iran that you brought up, that was what we were just discussing before I started. And I completely agree that rationality and irrationality is just like a continuum. You don't know where you have to put the line to divide rational action and irrational action. Even like what I have put there as the least bad option, that is irrational sort of decision making. You do the least bad option. So, the case of Iran that you brought up, it's actually a paper that I'm taking out of this data set, is that the way Iran also considers those, the rate of the blowbacks, but there are differences between these sponsoring states. Like, if US is doing that, they probably care less about the consequences than what Iran does. So Iran has employed a very, let's say, effective governance structure in providing support to these non-state armed groups so that they have mitigated the risk of blowback. It doesn't happen with Saudi Arabia or with the case of the US. That's another paper that, as I mentioned, I have taken out of this to actually compare these top sponsoring states and argue that, well, these three had this backfire blowback and Iran didn't have it because they managed these armed groups very well. And it is a rational decision for them to do that if it works for them. If they can control these groups, it is a rational decision to still keep doing this. For the US or Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, yeah, they do, and they say, okay, it's not my responsibility if it happens in 20 years. And I agree, yeah, that's very difficult to where we can draw the line between the rational decision or irrational decision. The other thing about whether Holocaust is the real motivation for Israel or not, yes, I know it was, again, too difficult to do that. Again, we were just talking about the methodology, whether you could interview the policymakers to get the correct response from them, to see why they did that. Well, first of all, you're not sure if they're honest with you. Yeah. Second, if you don't have access to all those important key people who make such policies. And so the only thing was foreign policy, like the official statements. That was the only source that I could have access to. And in those foreign policy statements, yes, they're hiding lots of things. But it's difficult to dig out everything, the truth out of that.
Yeah. I guess just engage them with a little bit of a degree of cynicism.
Yeah.
Healthy degree of cynicism.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
I have a quick question about...
Speak to the microphone on. Press that button, yeah. Okay.
Okay, I have a quick question about this specific motivation. So mainly it seems that there is just individual state think about the whole international system and take decisions based on what they have as ideological reason, whatever they have. Mainly, the main cause in your analysis is their ideology, which have historically constructed. So my question is that, do you think that taking decision, whether it's rational or irrational, is just based on individual states' ideological reason? Because the international system, they track the other states, and that kinds of interaction and that interactive process may impact their decision making. And it's also impact the BLOWBACK as well, because if you look at in case of Afghanistan in 1980s and 1990s. In 1990s, the whole proxy war handed over to regional players, and that regional players impacted it impacted somehow that Afghanistan political situation, which changed the sanctions for Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda attack on the U.S.A. in 9/11. So that type of blowback is not only directly the consequences of the responsive state. So there's other actors also involved in that, impacting that blowback as a consequences of the decision. At the same time, the decision is it's very difficult to think that it's just individual motivation, because it's still they are interact with other systems, international system, and that makes the whole process of decision-making processes. So what do you think about that kind of methodological question and also causal mechanism analysis of how we take decisions in the first place?
Yeah, that's right. So if we go back to this slide, in the categories that I have put here, it is not only ideological or identity components. So there are other categories like humanitarian concerns, geographic locations. These are other factors that actually influence foreign policy decision making.
But you mentioned that you mainly focus on internal variables, not external, which is maybe I understood as interactive processing system.
Yeah, well, there are external, internal variables, but what the finding was that, my finding about particularly about external support to non-state armed groups was that it is coming from the ideological, at least in their foreign policy statements, that's what they are trying to show, that, well, the decision is based on these ideological concerns. So I have put all the other categories, and the categories that these variables that I have put here is based on K.J. Holst's work. He was the one who introduced national role conception. So he has introduced different variables, that different competing voices that inform foreign policy decision making. So that's how I adopted these. There were some variables which were no longer in use; they were obsolete. So I omitted them, and I took up the other ones that are still relevant today. So, and if the last slide, I mentioned actually in the conclusion that yes, different imperatives actually inform the foreign policy decision making, but it is the ideological component that supersedes other imperatives. I'm not saying that it is exclusively just the ideological component.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, I'll be quick. Yes. Okay, thank you very much for this very, I think, interesting research and presentation. I have got a couple of questions, comments as well, followed mainly from Ben's remarks. The first one is about, I think, how this whole role of the national conception and narratives is maybe to ask how these three states turn out to become the largest sponsor of proxies and decisions. For example, in particular, if we tend to, maybe because of media tendency, Iran is doing the most of this kind of things these days, or Pakistan is doing the most of it in Afghanistan. But if you use this kind of empirical data, is it other than national conception? Is it the kind of the size of the power, the particular security environment they were in, or other kind of considerations that kind of motivate them to use this kind of proxy relations more than others? For example, how would Saudi Arabia compare with Iran? Because the two countries are sort of have similar kind of national conceptions of the role of religion, being kind of guardians of the leadership of Islamic world, and competing in the same sort of fields in Syria and Afghanistan and other countries, or India and Pakistan doing the same thing, for example, in Afghanistan. If we do that, probably we can explain the kind of variation in terms of the causal factor, also the mechanisms of how kind of this national conception can affect the way it does this kind of foreign policy choices. And the second one is concerning the role of agency power of member state actors. It's often in a lot of literature in this field, it's often see them as sort of like kind of mere instrument being used and abused by certain powers, right? Created and can be dismantled. And that concern with kind of the methodological approach you took as kind of being taken as static. Because a lot of these understood our groups change over time. They change in their objectives and interests and positions. Civil wars change. I wonder if that is something that you have taken into account in terms of, for example, Al-Qaeda being one day instrumental and useful for U.S. policy in Afghanistan fight against the Soviet Union, which was quite rational at that time, fighting a big war against a big enemy. But one day, that is no longer relevant. It turns out again it is the kind of blowback effect. It is kind of two kind of consideration which might be a bit too broad.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So what you just mentioned was in the third theme of the literature, the blowback, that addressing blowback issues. There is some literature about principal agent theory, how the agents that you employ today might actually turn against you or might actually go off the track. And yes, it is very likely that it happens, as I showed it, that's the statistics. But initially, states don't think about that one. And it is not the main concern. Even if they're aware of that, at least for these three top sponsoring states, it was not a concern for them. That's why they are the top sponsoring ones. And the way I collected the data, I did it very objectively. I didn't look for any strategic concerns, for example, for Israel or Saudi Arabia to say, okay, did they do it just because they had strategic concerns? For example, for Saudi Arabia, after Mujahideen turned into Al-Qaeda, they kept supporting other groups of Mujahideen in Europe, for example, in Bosnia. Before 9/11 attack happened, there were some people arrested in Bosnia who were actually linked to Saudi Arabia, and there were some cells. They were promoting this Wahhabi sort of ideology. And it was said that it was related to September 11 attacks. We didn't hear much about that in the media. But
some of those could be kind of just religious groups doing themselves, right? They're not necessarily.
They were directly supported by Saudi Arabia. Today's King Salman was prince back then, and he was actually appointed by King Khaled as the key person who collects funds in Saudi Arabia and then transfer the funds to these groups in Bosnia, other places in Europe, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So that was like a long-term policy. It just did not happen at one certain point of time.
I'm actually going to use my role as chair and also add some gender diversity into the questioning.
Sure.
Firstly, a comment. I think your conception of national role conception that's being pitted here is sort of a debate about whether constructivism or realism is the way to view international relations. And I think national role conception kind of actually bridges that, because the role to be the Dar al-Islam or that sort of thing, that could be an ideological goal, but it could also be a goal that sits very nicely within realist literature as well. I mean, it is also a hegemonic ambition, and I'm sure you've probably acknowledged that in your thesis somewhere. I really thought your data was interesting, so I just had a question about some of it. I was wondering, it was really interesting that Iran didn't suffer blowback in the way that other states did. I found that really interesting. And I was thinking a lot about the Hezbollah relationship in particular, which is not a relationship, it's been a really long relationship. I mean, that's a 40 I can't do maths, but since 1982, that's a really long relationship now. And so did you notice any patterns related to the length of these proxy relationships, or the nature of these proxy relationships that were less likely to create blowback?
Yeah, particularly about Iran, as I mentioned, I looked into the cases that Iran has supported, and I realized that, if Iran decided to provide support to a particular group, they had very strong controlling mechanisms. They knew what type of weapons they're going to give them and how much they're going to give them. Even like they counted the days they needed particular bullets or weapons. They were not just going say, okay, we have got this program to provide weapons to whoever is fighting on behalf of Assad in Syria. That didn't happen. Same thing with Hezbollah. There was less of ideological sympathy between Iran and the other groups. Whereas in the case of Saudi Arabia, you can see that Saudi Arabia has been providing support to all those Wahhabi organizations. In the case of Iran, you see that Iran does not have any problem with the ideological inclination of those groups that is supporting. Hamas is a Sunni group. Like the same as Hezbollah, they have been receiving support from Iran for 40 years. And they have had no problems. They didn't turn against Iran. And Iran has not let go of them. So in the case of Iran, there is a more calculated way of supporting these groups. They know how much they're giving them, for how long they're giving them, and how to control them just in case they're going to, as you said, for example, if they're going to backfire, how to control them or how to avoid that blowback.
Interesting. Thank you. We're probably going to have one more question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for presenting an excellent paper. I have a concern with the methodological issue as Khalid told. And I think the national role conception is a way to, it's a heuristic and collective approach to bridging the constructivist and realist debate in foreign policy decision making. It's my concern is that, as Khalid told, that the causal mechanism in terms of realist methodology and in terms of constructive methodology are defined, because realist methodology, in general, treat this causal mechanism from the perspectives of independent variables, and constructivist, they just generally take it as an intervening variable. So how you just have taken your causal mechanism, is it independent variables or independent variables? Because neoclassical realism has rational, they just view rational conceptions in terms of intervening variables, but constructivism just independent variables. So how do you look at it? Thank you.
Yeah, the main issue that I had with using like realism or traditional schools of IR was that we're talking about states' relations with non-state entities. And these non-state actors was the main problem. How could you explain or how could you justify that there are non-state entities acting in the international system the same way that states want to do? I know there are some realist interpretations of constructivist approach or constructivist realist trying to incorporate non-state entities as actors in the international system. But still there were lots of problems. And I thought, well, if you want to, I didn't want to get engaged in, let's say, conceptual arguments or debates, whether do we have to consider them, because if you're talking about allies, how can you say the non-state entities are allies of states in realism? There were issues like this, conceptual problems that I didn't want to go through realism or neorealism. And I preferred the approach which actually does not look at only states as unitary actors in the international system.
Okay, just my concern is that how do you distinguish this approach from neoclassical realist? Neoclassical realist causal mechanism. How do you distinguish your approach from neoclassical realist approach?
From neoclassical realism?
Neoclassics,
yeah. How to distinguish that, I don't know. I haven't had that in the research. I haven't had any discussion about how this is different from neoclassical realism. In what way? If you have any, how can you?
Neoclassical realism is used to look at the national conception of leadership and the identity factors are intervening variables. They just talk about mass about these things. You also talking about. They also focus on the causal mechanism, and also are just talking about the causal mechanism. So how?
But still, it's looking at rational choice, sort of, yeah. And again, the problem I had was how do you justify a rational choice when you're looking at 92% of blowback, the high rate of blowback? That was again another conceptual issue, because if I was going through like traditional IR theories, we have got this rationalism in all those approaches, but that's difficult to justify a decision that has continued over time, regardless of this high rate of blowback. That was the problem.
Okay. I realise I'm a very brave woman standing between all these people and their lunch, but I have said one more question from the back, and then we will wrap up.
It's working.
Yes.
Thanks for that. It's quite illuminating. My question is more about, I suppose, the flavor of the ideological paradigm that's driving foreign policy. And I understand that it mightn't be about decision making and what your research is about, but I'm just curious about thoughts around the table as well as yours. That in finding, it's sort of seeming that the ideological paradigm that is driving our foreign policy around the world is sort of the underpinnings or the principles that are driving it come from a sense of either or. So it's sort of, and this is just a legit question in terms of, do these ideologies, can they sit together and coexist and validate each other? Or is it that the ideology of it's me over something else or someone else? Do you understand what I'm saying? Is at the end of the day, everything's said and done and everyone killed and, you know, half maimed in the process. With all due respect. What becomes the flavor of foreign policy? You see, can ideologies actually bring advancement and prosperity in bringing people together, or are these ideologies or current ideologies, the underpinnings of them, so separate and so they cannot rationally sit together, so that it's always going to be really a game of how am I going to exist at the cost of something else, a compromise. You get this feeling when you're doing your research, and of course, a legit question to everyone else around the world.
Yeah, exactly. That was a very interesting point, because when I was particularly looking at the case of Saudi Arabia, early 1980s, we had this Islamic revolution in Iran, and there were some exchange of letters between the Shiite revolutionary Iran with the Saudi king. And the way they were so intolerant of each other, as if, based on the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, the only true Muslims are Wahhabis. There is no other version of Islam other than that. And perhaps Shiites merit death because of their idolatry or because of their diversion or other issues. So that was very interesting how that escalated from the very beginning, how the Ayatollah Khomeini was actually sending letters saying that, well, you're not qualified to be the custodian of the two holy mosques. And on the other hand, we had the Saudi king arguing that, no, you're not even Muslims, we don't consider you anything. Or, so I don't think they can sit next to each other and perhaps coexist peacefully. Or in the case of US, if there is one leader for the free world, the way they were looking at Soviet Union, looking at like the evil communists, the words that, the terminology they used for referring to Soviet Union, even nowadays you see that lots of American policymakers still look at like the evil empire. If it's not Soviet Union, still Russia is there, but they look at them as adversaries. They don't look at them as like political allies.
So the question was just that, can we see an elevation of foreign policy rather than this divisive nature of the games of, who will survive, an elevated wholeness of humanity? But I suppose maybe too much to answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mohsen, for what was a really, really fascinating presentation. And I think from the questions, much food for thought for all of us to take part this afternoon with us. Lunch has just been served. Thank you to Saki for rescuing it for us behind the scenes. So please join us for lunch and to continue this discussion. In the meantime, please join me in thanking Mohsen.
Thank you.